So a few days ago, Politico published a report. You see it up on your screen here. The title was Trump Weighs Consequences for NATO Allies on Naughty List, describing how the White House has drawn up a tiered list of NATO allies sorted by who backed America during the Iran war and who didn't. Quote, the White House has developed something akin to a naughty and nice list of NATO countries as the Trump administration looks for ways to punish allies who refuse to back the Iran war. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole article. I'd rather just talk about what's happening here. The list reportedly lays out members' contributions to the alliance and reflects Pentagon rhetoric about, quote, model allies deserving special favor while others face consequences. Now, the coverage of this ever since the beginning of the war, Trump has been talking about NATO not helping out and criticizing NATO. There's been all these, signaling that maybe we're going to change the arrangement. He's been very critical of NATO since the beginning of the Iran war. And all that coverage has been framed as Trump kind of lashing out. The allies didn't give him what he wanted on Iran. So now he's threatening to downgrade the relationships. He's angry. He's unpredictable. He's transactional, the usual interpretation. And the argument that you'll hear from most analysts based on this framing is that once the Iran situation cools off, the alliance is going to stabilize, Trump will move on, and NATO will muddle through as it always has. And this is just a kind of temporary temper tantrum. That's the way it's being perceived. And that's why I made this video, because this reading is incorrect. And it's very clear to see why it's incorrect, because of a document that was published a few months before the Iran war by the White House. And it's called the National Security Strategy of the United States. It was published in November of 2025. Okay, and if you read the National Security Strategy, the Trump that they published, you'll find that this moment that we're in right now, and this rhetoric that you're hearing, this Politico piece talking about punishing allies who aren't stepping up, and everything that Trump's been saying about NATO since the war started, this tiered ally list, putting people into different categories based on how much they helped, is not a reaction to the Iran war. It is actually the implementation of a doctrine, of a policy doctrine that was already written, it was already published, and it was sitting in plain sight. It's laid out in detail. So today what we're going to do is we're going to unpack what the doctrine actually says. Now, it's a 30-page document. We're not going to read it. We're going to unpack what that doctrine says, why Europe's failure on Iran was entirely predictable, and why, most importantly, this is not a passing temper tantrum. It's not a passing storm for the NATO alliance. And therefore, we have to take it very seriously, because looking downrange, we have to expect that, because it was laid out as policy in advance, that the consequences that they're talking about are real. This is not bluster. So let's start with the National Security Strategy. Let's just call it the NSS, because we're going to be mentioning it a lot. That's what we'll call this document. So what does the NSS actually say? Because most people haven't read it. So it opens with a direct rebuke of the post-Cold War American foreign policy. It argues that Washington's foreign policy establishment convinced itself that permanent global dominance was something achievable and desirable. And in pursuing that, it harmed America. It hollowed out the very foundations of American power. It hollowed out America's industrial base, the middle class, the sense that America's foreign commitments reflected the actual interests and values of its people, rather than the ambitions of a foreign policy class insulated from the costs. That's what was hollowed out. There's a sense that they lost sight of that. So that all gets laid out in the opening of the document. The NSS then explicitly rejects this whole model of global hegemony of America. It replaces it with something called America First. But it defines the term America First with a lot more precision than the slogan usually gets. So the document states that a proper strategy must evaluate, sort, and prioritize. Evaluate, sort, and prioritize. That not every country, not every region, and not every cause can be the focus of American attention. The purpose of foreign policy, they say, is the protection of core American interests. Full stop. Sounds simple, but it's a clean break from the liberal internationalist tradition that governed American foreign policy since 1945. No more treating NATO as a sacred institution to be preserved regardless of whether or not it actually serves American interests. No more underwriting Europe's defense while Europe questions American judgment. The NSS is built on 10 principles. Among them are focused national interest, peace through strength, which we're very familiar with, flexible realism, primacy of nations, and crucially for today's discussion, for this video, fairness and burden sharing. That's what we're going to talk about. Fairness and burden sharing. The document is explicit that America will no longer tolerate free rides, trade imbalances, or allies who benefit from American guarantees without reciprocating. And it goes further. It states that the days of the United States propping up the entire world order are over. Wealthy allies must assume primary responsibility for their own regions. The Hague Commitment, which is the commitment that the NATO members will pledge 5%, that they will spend 5% of their GDP on defense, is named in the document directly as the new baseline. That's the framework. Now let's look at how Europe is failing this test, or just failed it in these last couple of months. So the NSS names the Middle East as a core zone of interest. Specifically, it talks about the Strait of Hormuz. The document states that America must ensure that Gulf energy supplies do not fall into hostile hands, and that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open. This was published doctrine, not improvised policy. Think about that. We're all talking about the Strait of Hormuz and it's got to remain open. In November, they wrote this in the document. And then in early 2026, Operation Epic Fury, the war we're in, the U.S.-Israeli campaign, which built on the June 2025 strikes of Midnight Hammer, the strikes on the nuclear facilities. This new campaign, this new war required logistical support from European bases. And here is what happened. Some of it you've heard already. Spain, France, and Italy either closed their airspace to U.S. aircraft completely or denied use of their military bases during the Iran war. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, who is the target of a lot of President Trump's ire of late. So Pedro Sanchez confirmed that Spain denied permission for bombers and tanker aircraft linked to the American operation, denied them permission to enter or pass through his airspace. He was proud of this. We're denying the Americans use of our airspace. France prevented Israel from using its airspace to transport American weapons. Italy denied landing rights to several U.S. bombers at the Sigonella base in Sicily. Now, the reaction from Washington was very clear. Trump called these allies cowards for refusing to join the war, to open the Strait of Hormuz. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the administration would, quote, have to re-examine the value of NATO. Trump said that he might withdraw from NATO altogether. Rubio put the strategic logic very plainly. He said, when we need them to allow us to use their military bases, the answer is no, then why are we in NATO? And the emphasis should be on we. Why are we in NATO? You know, to anyone who's read this document, the NSS, none of this was surprising. I mean, everything we've seen from Trump and Rubio about NATO since the beginning of the Iran war. If you read the NSS, you saw it. The document had already named this exact scenario as the test of allied reliability. So when Trump has said that we really don't need the NATO nations, we really don't need their help, I was just testing them, which looked like kind of sour grapes. Like we wanted their help, and now that they didn't give it, fine, I didn't need you anyway. No. This is already stated as a test in the NSS in November. It was stated that the willingness to help out in securing the Strait of Hormuz, to allow flow of oil, etc., is already listed in there as a test of their reliability. The question worth asking is why these allies said no. And the answer goes deeper than geopolitics. Here's the conversation that the NSS anticipates and that European governments are reluctant to have openly, because the NSS discusses this too. It's estimated that there are 46 million Muslims in Europe, 6% of the total population. The Middle East Forum reports this. The share of the European population is growing, and the political weight it carries, that this share of their population carries, is already having a huge impact. It's reshaping the foreign policy decisions of these European nations. That's what we're seeing now. How many big foreign policy decisions have European nations had to make in recent years? And with this influx of Muslims and these huge numbers that we all know about, this is the first big test of European foreign policy since the massive waves of immigration of Muslims. And we're seeing that the Muslim population is shaping foreign policy decisions in a way that is now, it's impossible to ignore it. Pew Research projects that Sweden will become 30.6% Muslim by 2050. France, 18%, Germany, 19.7%, and the UK, 17.2%. Now, the political implications are already visible. We know that. You can see it in the polling. European Muslims are most sharply distinguished from majority populations on opinions about America. That's where they're really different. They're also very different from native European populations on the war on terrorism, on Iran, and on the Middle East. This is kind of obvious, isn't it? European Muslims give the United States lower favorability ratings than the general public in Europe, the rest of the general public. And the Middle East Forum was direct about the connection during the Iran war. European governments are reluctant to support American and Israeli-led attacks against Iran because they fear the conflict could spill into their own streets. That's why they were so adamant about refusing to be involved. They have these massive Muslim populations, and they know that if they join in, they're going to have unrest domestically. This is all in the Middle East Forum piece. They cited the UK Prime Minister Starmer, who hosted hundreds of Muslims for the end of Ramadan ceremony in Westminster Hall, a gesture that was widely read as preemptive political reassurance ahead of his government's decision not to authorize offensive operations. That's reading from the report, from the Middle East Forum report. Now, the Trump NSS, this document, had already diagnosed this problem. In its Europe chapter, in the 30-page document, the document warns that certain NATO members will become majority non-European within a few decades, and raises the direct question of whether such members will view their alliance obligations in the same way as the people who originally signed the NATO Charter, right? If Europe is becoming increasingly influenced by a Muslim street, or it doesn't even have to be the majority. If you have a significant enough minority of the population that is pro-Islamic and anti-West, are these NATO nations going to continue to honor their NATO commitments? And that's why this Iran situation was a test case. Think of how extraordinary this is. This document, the NSS, names the civilizational question facing Europe directly, and the Iran war just gave it a concrete example, a concrete operational example of this problem. And when Spain, France, and Italy refused to get involved and refused to allow America to use their airspace, etc., I mentioned everything they did, they weren't making a purely strategic geopolitical calculation. They were responding to domestic political realities that are shaped by demographics. The NSS addresses this dynamic in the priorities section as well. Everything we're seeing was anticipated. The document warns against the manipulation of immigration systems to build voting blocs whose loyalties lie outside of Europe. The NSS doesn't treat mass migration as merely a humanitarian question. It treats it as a variable that reshapes the geostrategic reliability of these allies. Are they still reliable? And in the NSS, it anticipates this problem. So if the old NATO model is broken, what does the Trump doctrine propose instead? Well, the NSS document is clear. The goal isn't to abandon alliances, it's to restructure them around a different logic that is more in line with what's actually going on. Okay? The document describes targeted partnerships that use economic tools to align incentives and share burdens with allies who are genuinely willing to take ownership of their regions. That's the language. The model that is presented in the NSS is explicitly transactional, but the transaction isn't just about defense spending percentages, 5% or less than 5%. It's about strategic alignment and reliability, demonstrable reliability. The NSS states that America will extend more favorable treatment on commercial matters, technology sharing, defense procurement to countries that are willing to take more responsibility for their security in their neighborhood, in their part of the world. That's the precise logic behind the tiered list that is now being assembled in Washington. Again, this isn't a knee-jerk reaction to what's happening with Iran. This was the plan all along. Options reportedly being considered include shifting troops. It's all in the Politico piece. Shifting troops around, scaling back joint exercises, redirecting military cooperation away from less cooperative member states towards more reliable ones, with countries such as Poland and Romania seen as beneficiaries. Poland fits the NSS model almost exactly. It spends well above 3% of GDP on defense. It's close to 5%. It welcomed American military presence on its soil. It's been unambiguous about threats to its region. And during the Iran crisis, it didn't close its airspace or its bases. The Baltic states were the same. These are governments that still believe that they have a society worth defending, that they have a culture worth defending, so they act accordingly. They step up. Secretary Hegseth articulated this before the war even began. He said, quote, exemplary allies such as Israel, South Korea, Poland, increasingly Germany, the Baltic countries, and others will enjoy our special favor. Those who do not fulfill their share in collective defense will face consequences. Now, the word exemplary matters here. It's not simply about spending. It's about strategic character. The NSS envisions America as the country that sets the terms, provides the strategic backbone, and steps in when the stakes are highest, not the country that shows up first, stays the longest, and pays the most when its allies, its allies just manage their own domestic politics at a safe distance from their security concerns. No. Allies that take ownership of their regions, that spend and act, and don't just defer to to put it on the Americans to defend them. These are the allies that the Trump doctrine rewards. And then there's Israel. And it's kind of relevant to this video, so let me just put in a plug for the Israel 365 News YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed there, you should be. We talk about a lot of geopolitics there. I just did another interview with Dr. David Wormser today about the situation in Iran. You don't want to miss that one. I think it's being uploaded today or tomorrow. But go into the playlist section on that site, on the Israel 365 News channel, and find the playlist called Israel, the Rise of a Regional Superpower. It's 6 videos, 6 short videos, 12 to 15 minutes each, which lay out everything that's happened since October 7th in terms of how Israel's position in the world has changed. And it's very relevant to this entire conversation that we are having right now. So Israel is held up by the Trump administration explicitly in this NSS, in this document, both explicitly and implicitly, as the clearest example of what an alliance relationship ought to look like. The NSS mentions Israel in the context of the Abraham Accords. It frames Iran's degradation as a joint achievement, U.S. and Israel. It notes that Iran was already granted, it notes that Iran was already weakened by Israeli military action since October 7th, 2023, before Operation Midnight Hammer, because of everything Israel was doing to the proxies, etc. Israel was already doing the work before America stepped in. And that is mentioned in the document. And consider what that means in terms of the overall policy that this NSS document is pushing. Israel took care of a lot of the work themselves. Israel does not ask America to fight its wars. It asks for weapons. It shares intelligence. It asks for diplomatic backing, but it acts. Israel takes action on its own. It absorbs risk. It absorbs casualties. Israel invests well over 5% of GDP on defense. Israel maintains world-class intelligence and a military with genuine high-end war-fighting capability, which means that when Iran's nuclear infrastructure needed to be destroyed, Israel had already spent years degrading the air defenses and the missiles that were standing in the way. America's role was to complete the mission, not to initiate it. Yes, it was a piece that Israel couldn't do. But this is exactly what the NSS document's talking about. Doing your share, fighting, being willing to take risks as a partner of America. That's the NSS model in practice. A regional power that takes ownership of its neighborhood security, that acts decisively when required, that comes to the partnership with real capability rather than dependency. Of course, we can't do everything America can do, but we don't just rely on America to defend us. Contrast that with Europe now. Spain closes its bases to America. France blocks weapons transfers. Italy denies landing rights to the US. Countries that have outsourced their own security to the United States for 80 years are now citing international law and domestic political pressure as excuses, as reasons to withhold the logistical access that makes American power projection possible. The NSS explicitly condemns this. It describes, and this is in November, before it happened, it describes allies who benefit from American security guarantees but refuse to support American interests as the very definition of the problem that this document was written to solve. I don't know if these European leaders read the document. It predicts their behavior. It warns against it. The NSS document's language on fairness is unambiguous. The arrangement must work in both directions or it will be restructured until it does. Israel is the counterweight or the rebuttal, right? It's the opposite of the European model. It's what genuine burden sharing looks like. A country that earns its alliance rather than assumes it. The NSS closes with an argument that gets less attention than the geopolitical sections, but it might be the most important passage in the whole document. It argues that long-term security depends on the restoration of American spiritual and cultural health, that a nation without confidence in its own identity and purpose cannot project power or sustain alliances over time. The same logic applied outward runs through everything we've discussed. The allies on the right side of Washington's list aren't simply the ones who spend more money. And this is the key point here. That's not the only thing that makes them on the right side. There are also states that still believe in standing for something worth defending. They believe in defending their society, their culture, and they're prepared to act on that belief when the moment demands it. So the cultural erosion of Europe is not separate from the geopolitical timidity. It's the same thing. Europe's refusal to support the Iran operation wasn't a disagreement about international law or logistics. It was a signal of the much deeper problem. These are governments that are managing their foreign policies around the domestic political consequences of the transformation of their societies demographically. And they're hoping that the American security guarantees will remain there regardless of how they behave. And the Trump NSS says that era is over. This tiered ally list is the first concrete example, but I don't think it'll be the last. Again, this was all laid out in November, and then here comes the Iran war, and they failed the test. Anyway, so that's where we are. Should get more interesting. Keep watching. Thank you for watching the channel, helping it grow. Please like and subscribe and share this video so that you can tell everyone what we're doing on this channel. Hope it was helpful. God bless.